Frank Sinatra was married 4 times, and his marriage to final wife Barbara seems from the outside to have been the most successful. It was his longest, and he died with her by his side. However, Frank's children, all of whom came from the crooner's first marriage, never liked Barbara. In fact, one of them even blames Barbara for their father's death. Nancy Sinatra Jr. feels her father could have lived longer. When Frank Sinatra died, he was 83. Most of his fans assumed he had lived as long and fulfilling of a life as he could have. But one figure feels Frank could have gone on for a few more years if it wasn't for the fact he was stuck in a negative domestic situation. That figure is Nancy Sinatra Jr. Frank was a notorious womanizer who slept with many women over the course of his life, though he only married 4. However, as Nancy Jr. likes to put it, 4th wife Barbara liked to pretend she was the only one Frank was ever married to. This certainly rubbed Frank's children the wrong way, as all 3 of them came from Frank's first marriage. Nancy has claimed since her father's death, she felt like Barbara was trying to erase her, her siblings, and her mother from Frank's past. Frank's first wife was Nancy Barbato, and he married her before becoming a star. Frank and Nancy were married from 1939 to 1951, meaning that lasted a good deal longer than both his second and third marriages combined. Frank's marriage to Ava Gardner was incredibly tumultuous and lasted from 1951 to 57, with the 2 stars being drunk the majority of the time. Around a decade later, Frank married Mia Farrow for a period of little over a year, starting in 1966. Frank's last marriage was his longest. Frank Sinatra's marriage to 4th and final wife Barbara was the longest one he had. It also was seemingly the most successful, though recent remarks from the late singer's children suggest things were not quite so peaceful within the Sinatra home towards the end of Frank's life. Frank's marriage to Nancy started out before he became famous, and Nancy didn't exactly like the changes she saw happening in her husband when he started getting attention as a singer. Frank started partying excessively and cheating on Barbara with other women, including Ava Gardner. His affair with Ava Gardner is said to have been what finally put an end to the crooner's first marriage. He went on to marry Ava the same year of his first divorce, though Frank and Ava seem to have been relatively miserable throughout the entirety of their union. Frank and Barbara met years before their marriage. Frank Sinatra's kids had watched their father stumble drunkenly through his marriages to Mia Farrow and Ava Gardner, and they didn't think much of it. But things seemed quite a bit different when Barbara came around. Frank and Barbara had first met in 1957, when Frank was just getting over his relationship with second wife Ava Gardner. At this point, he was partying harder than ever, and it was in a drunken Las Vegas stupor that the singer first beckoned to Barbara. Apparently, Frank was hanging out with his fellow Rat Pack members Sammy Davis Jr. and Dean Martin when he noticed a beautiful blonde showgirl across the bar. That was Barbara, and a drunken Frank proceeded to catcall her. Barbara ignored him, even after her friend explained to her that the drunken catcalling man was Frank Sinatra. According to the late Barbara, she wasn't in the mood to deal with drunks. His first attempts to woo Barbara seemed to have failed, and the showgirl later ended up married to classic comedic actor Zeppo Marx. Zeppo and Barbara then ended up moving into the same California neighborhood as Sinatra, after which point Frank and Barbara struck up a friendship. Of course, this later turned into a romance. Before we tell you more about it, be sure to give this video a like and subscribe to Facts First if you haven't already. Frank and Barbara ended up becoming more than friends. Sometime after Frank Sinatra's marriage to Mia Farrow ended in 1968, Frank and Barbara became more than friends. At the time, Barbara was still married to Zeppo Marx. The fact that Barbara was willing to cheat on Zeppo arguably should have been seen by Frank as a red flag, though Frank and Barbara's marriage still ended up being the longest of the 4 of his marriages. Barbara's affair with Frank caused her and Zeppo's marriage to dissolve, and they divorced in 1973. By that point, Frank and Barbara had already begun to take things to the next level in their relationship. She would accompany him all over the world for his performances, and it seems like the two were a match made in heaven. Barbara could drink almost as much as Frank could, and she even smoked just as much as him. But she went on to claim Frank insisted she quit smoking after they got married. Legend has it Frank proposed to his 4th and final wife by placing a beautiful diamond engagement ring in a glass of champagne. Barbara said yes, and the pair tied the knot in 1976. Shortly before the wedding ceremony went down, Barbara claims she was handed a prenuptial agreement to sign. As the woman seemingly had no ulterior motives in the marriage, she signed without thinking. Barbara asked Frank to annul his first marriage. One thing that made Frank Sinatra's fourth marriage different than his second and third is that it was officiated with a Catholic ceremony. This meant Frank's first marriage to wife Nancy Barbato had to be retroactively annulled. Annulment is often done for religious purposes, as was the case with Frank and Nancy. While Frank and Nancy had been divorced for over 2 decades by that point, the annulment was said to still have hurt Nancy. In addition to that, Frank's demand for the annulment also rubbed Nancy Jr. the wrong way. She felt the annulment was one of Barbara's attempts to try and erase Frank's past so she could be considered the only true wife the crooner had. Nancy Jr. also claimed that another attempt to overwrite his past was when Barbara tried to convince Frank to adopt her adult son, as the son was well into his adult years. Giving Barbara the benefit of the doubt, she likely only cared about such things as divorce and adoption because she felt they were the proper things to do. But it's certainly understandable that Nancy Jr. would have negative feelings about seeing her father start a new family with a new woman. For all intents and purposes, Frank's second and third marriages had been extended, but with Barbara, Frank finally found a replacement for Nancy Barbato, and his kids noticed. Nancy Jr. blames Barbara for Frank's death. Nancy Jr. has taken her criticism of her father's fourth wife so far that she's even come to blame Barbara for her father's death. According to Nancy Jr., her father would have lived longer if it hadn't been for the fact he was forced to live with such a cruel woman. Nancy Jr. points to things like the fact Barbara refused to personally call her when her father was on his deathbed. According to Nancy Jr., she had to learn about the fact that her father was about to die from the doctor, as Barbara refused to contact her. This certainly seems cruel, but one also has to consider the fact that Barbara likely and rightfully thought that Nancy Jr. hated her. After this incident, Nancy Jr. vowed to never speak another word to her stepmother again, and she made good on her promise. Barbara passed away in 2017, 2 decades after Frank's death. Over these years, Nancy Jr. claims she never spoke to her late stepmother a single time. After Barbara's passing, she was buried alongside Frank, but it seems Nancy Jr. got the last laugh. Upon Frank's death, Barbara had his gravesite marked with a stone that referred to Frank as a beloved husband and father. Sometime after Barbara's passing, this gravestone was replaced with a new one that read, "Sleep warm, Papa." Of course, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out this change was made by one of Frank's children, and that whichever of the kids made the change didn't feel that the fact about their father being a beloved husband was all that important in the long run. Now it's time to hear from you. What part of the story was most surprising to hear about? Let us know in the comments section below. And before you go, make sure you give this video a like and subscribe to Facts First if you haven't already. Click the bell icon to stay updated on all our latest content.